We're going to concentrate on digital cameras in this video, but what you can learn can also be applied to the settings on your smartphone, action camera, and your point and shoot as well. Those smaller cameras have the camera and the lens rolled into one handy package. That's really easy to use, but it does limit the capabilities of the camera. The nice thing about higher end digital cameras is that they allow you to chop and change your camera and the lens depending on the situation. We've already discussed cameras, but the other part of the camera then to focus that light is the lens. Through this video, I just want to give you a brief understanding of all the terms associated with the camera and the settings, because you'll undoubtedly hear them and see them at some point too. So lenses come in many forms, but it's almost always a tube of some sort with glass on the inside that focuses the light in the camera to give you a picture. In some lenses, you can actually move the glass on the inside to look further away or closer up. On most lenses too, there'll also be a ring that can make the picture sharp or focus it. So some of the parameters associated with lenses are usually focal length in millimeters and then aperture in f numbers. And we'll cover aperture in a little bit, but the focal length is a name for the amount of zoom that you get with a lens. So zoom has less to do with the actual camera itself and more to do with the lens you put on it. The higher the number, the more zoomed in the picture. 20 millimeters means you can fit a lot in a wide picture. 200 millimeters means you're zoomed in at something really far away. Some lenses allow you to zoom in and then out, but some lenses are fixed, which means you can't zoom in or out, and they're called prime lenses. What you should be able to do them though is choose what's in focus. You can choose autofocus or manual focus on a lot of cameras. Now some autofocus is good, but some's really bad. If you put it in manual, it's all up to you to do it. Depending on your lens, you might have some sort of indicator that tells you how far away the thing is that you focused on. So 3 feet, 10 feet, maybe more. But by looking through the eyepiece, you can normally tell what's in focus. And if your subject isn't moving much, like in an interview or a piece of camera, just focus on your subject and then leave it in manual focus. A lot of the time cameras will do something called hunting, where they look for the thing that's supposed to be in focus, and it can become really distracting. The lens you get will also play a part in how much light gets through to the sensor inside your camera. Next, we're going to take a quick look at exposure. There are 3 settings on your camera that are arguably the most important, and it's a side effect of them being both photo and video cameras. This means if you're learning either, you kind of only have to learn it once, but they're really important to understand. These 3 settings are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. These 3 together make up the exposure triangle. Shutter speed is basically how long your camera sensor is exposed to the outside world, how long it's got to capture a picture. Now for photography, that matters an awful lot more if you're trying to capture a moment in time. And shutter speed is measured in time, from something like 1/4000th of a second right up to 30 seconds or more. For us as filmmakers though, there's a pretty good rule that says we want our shutter speed to be double our frame rate, so it can stay pretty similar all the time. And you can basically just leave it on 1/50th of a second. Up next is aperture. And like I said earlier, this is actually part of your lens. That's because the aperture is a physical number that's based on the amount of light that's let through the lens by a hole that opens and closes. And we sometimes call this the speed of the lens. It's denoted by an f value, so f2.8 lets a lot of light through a large hole, f22 means there's a lot less light that gets through a small hole. And changing these values means that there's more or less light. And it also has a side effect, changing how much is in focus. f2.8 means there's a lot less in focus, f22 means there's a lot more in focus. Last of our exposure settings is ISO, another holdover from the film days. And it was the speed of the film, how sensitive it was to light. Now we use it for the sensor inside the camera, and it ranges from the low end of the scale around ISO 100 and goes quite high past ISO 6400. And by changing these settings, you aren't actually changing how much light falls on the sensor, but how sensitive the sensor is to the light that falls on it. The downside is that as you make it more sensitive, the picture becomes more unstable and grainy. So wherever possible, we like to leave it as low as we can. Up there with exposure is color. One of the most obvious buttons on your camera will probably say WB on it. And this one's pretty simple. It means white balance. It basically tells the camera what's white in real life is also white on the camera. The settings for these are pretty straightforward as well, because they're based on scenarios. So if it's a cloudy day, it's a cloudy setting. If it's a sunshiny day, it's a sunshine setting, an indoor one, etc. Every time you change location, you should probably be changing this as well. But you could put it on auto white balance if the color isn't changing too much in the same scene. Audio is something we're going to spend a whole video on because it's so important, arguably more important than the video itself. Now on your camera, you probably got some small holes where the microphone is. On smaller cameras, you won't have the option to level up your audio, but on higher end digital cameras, you can actually plug in an external microphone. That's probably one of the first things you should do. You might even have a headphone jack so you can listen to it back in real time. And this is really good for picking up wind, traffic, things like that. Things that you might not pick up until you start to edit. Okay, so frame rate again is kind of a holdover from the film days, kind of. On a reel of film, they would play back a certain amount of images per second. And your digital camera does this too. In 1 second, we might see 25 images play back on our screen. To us, it just looks like a moving image, and this is the frame rate. How many frames or still images your camera records in a second. And you can change this, though I'd probably urge you not to. If you're in the US, your standard frame rate might be 30 frames per second. In Europe, it's more like 25. And the reason people sometimes shoot at 50 or 60 frames per second is because if you shoot 1 second of film with 50 frames in it, you can actually watch it back over 2 seconds at half the speed. It's how we get slow motion footage from these cameras. But for the most part, 25 frames per second is absolutely fine. You'll probably see somewhere in your screen the resolution that your camera shoots in. You'll more than likely hear now of 720p, 1080p and 4K. And there are more of course, but these are the most common. We're right on the tail end of getting rid of 720p, so don't worry about that one. 1080p is just regular HD, high definition footage. Good enough for mobile phones, computer screens, TV screens and everything in between. It's measured by the height in pixels, so 1920 pixels wide by 1080 tall. 4K then is actually 3840 by 2160 or 4096 by 2160. Now, there's no real disadvantage to shooting at a higher resolution for the most part, other than it's going to take up more memory and maybe more difficult to edit. But regular HD, 1080p is definitely still good enough for most of the ways that we watch videos. Lastly, let's touch on memory cards. And we'll do a whole video on these, but each camera manufacturer might use a different type of memory card. A pretty standard one across most manufacturers is an SD card. And there's lots to talk about with these, but the main thing you'll notice is the capacity. 8 gigabytes, 32 gigabytes, 64 gigabytes, 128 gigabytes. My recommendation would always be to go for a memory card from a known brand, something like a SanDisk, and probably around the 32 gigabyte mark. If you find you fill up a 32 gigabyte card quickly, you can always upgrade, but don't go for anything too small. You want to be able to shoot for an entire day using this and then back up all that footage so you don't lose it. So these are your camera basics, and you'll get more used to them over time and with practice, but remember that it's still okay to use some of the auto functions while you're learning. The aim here isn't to make scientists into fully fledged filmmakers. It's to give scientists the tools and knowledge that they need to share their stories through film, and your story is worth sharing.